Greetings, beginning Photoshop students. I'm going to talk to you about some more basic tools, including sharpen, blur, and smudge tools. We're going to learn how you can sharpen an area of an image, blur areas of your image, and smudge the areas of the image, and what the difference is between blur and smudge. These tools are located here. It looks like a little raindrop, and that's your blur tool. We also have the sharpen tool and the smudge tool, and they're all located together and grouped together in the tools panel. So to begin, sometimes you have a photograph that you enjoy very much, but you feel like one area of the photograph needs to be sharpened just a little bit. And sometimes it's around the eye area that you'd like to be sharpened, or that you'd like to be able to see the expression just a little bit. Or if you see that it's slightly blurred when you zoom in, there might be an opportunity to sharpen a bit of the image. So I can use my sharpen tool, which is selected here under the blur tool, and then I need to choose my brush size. Now my brush size determines how large of an area I'm going to actually sharpen. Now in this case, the eye area is pretty small, and if I want to zoom in, I can get a better look at the eye area, like so. And then I can choose my brush size appropriately, and I also want to choose between a hard or a soft brush. Right now I've got a very soft brush selected. As you can see, hardness is set to 0%. If I move the slider up, I get a very hard-edged brush. It's the difference between adding water in watercolors and having a very soft-edged brush. So the more water that I add, the less hardness to the edge of my brush, if that makes sense. A very dry or hard-edged brush is going to give me some hard-edged lines. Now in the case of the sharpen tool, I don't necessarily want a particularly hard edge because I want it to blend in with other areas of the photograph. So I would suggest starting with a relatively soft brush, let's say about 20%. For this particular task. It varies from task to task. And then the size of the brush, you can see that this might be a pretty good size. I could bump it down just a little bit. And then I can use my sharpen tool to go in and attempt to sharpen the image around the eye area. I also have the strength set to 50%. So notice here in my tool options panel that I can adjust the strength of the tool and how much I want it to sharpen. Now this is a little bit of a blurred image, but it's not too bad. If I use an extremely, let's add a new layer so you can see the difference. So let's duplicate this layer. And if I use 100% strength in sharpening, and maybe I'm going to use, you can see I could use an inappropriately large brush, and I could use a very hard brush, I'm going to get this kind of an effect. And that's too much. What the sharpen tool does is it attempts to look at the neighboring pixel data and de-anti-alias. Anti-aliasing is the degree to which neighboring pixels actually blend together using gradients. So that was too much. That was an inappropriate brush size. That was an inappropriate amount of strength for this tool, and we had it set to very, very hard. So that didn't work out for us. And sometimes working with these new tools, it's sort of, you're going to have to experiment, and you might experience happy accidents as you experiment. So let's duplicate the layer again. And this time I am going to choose a more appropriate size brush. I'm going to choose a relatively soft brush set to maybe about 20%. I'm going to turn the strength down to about 75%. And then I'm going to just click around the eyes. I'm going to de-anti-alias. I'm just attempting to bring out a little more detail around the eyes. Now if we zoom out just a little bit, you can then possibly see the difference. It may be difficult to see if you're viewing this online, but you can see that I have sharpened the areas around the eyes just slightly, and so that we can see, it just kind of makes the eyes pop a little bit more. And that's probably the most appropriate use for the sharpen tool, is to make something pop a little bit more or add detail in something that's gotten a little bit over anti-aliased. Alright, let's talk about our next tool, which is the blur tool. Now the blur tool actually does the opposite of the sharpen tool. It anti-aliases nearby pixels. Let's look at an image where it might be appropriate to add some blurring. If we had this butterfly image and we wanted to maybe focus on the butterfly and blur the other elements just a little bit. So we're working with the concept of depth of field. Depth of field is an effect whereby the subject comes into focus and the background tends to blur away in the background. So I'm going to duplicate this layer again so you can see. Oops, I don't want to do that. I actually want to duplicate the layer so you can see how this effect works. Now in this case I'm going to use a much larger brush because the area that I would like to blur out is outside of the butterfly. So I'm going to use a larger brush. I'm also going to use a relatively soft brush. I want again to use a brush that's got a bit of water applied to it. If I used a hard brush, it would be sort of counterintuitive when we're talking about blurring, because blurring is actually where the pixels are anti-aliasing. That's where they're going to kind of blend together using gradients. And then the strength of this brush, I'm going to have it a little bit stronger. And here I go. I'm going to start by blurring the background. And I'm just simply running the brush over areas of the image that are not the butterfly. As I get closer to the butterfly, I'm going to kind of back off on my blur effect. Because again, this is a depth of field. We're trying to fake depth of field, and we're doing so by bringing the subject more into focus, which is, in this case, the butterfly. So I'm just going to blur these areas a little bit, and some of the foliage in the background. I'm going to blur it out. And I click and drag as if I'm adding water. If this were a watercolor, it would be like using a paintbrush that has been dipped in clear water. And it's not as dramatic as the blur effect that you would get with watercolor, but that's kind of the basic idea. And now you can kind of look at the difference, the before and the after. We've blurred out areas that were not the subject of the image, and so that's kind of a quick and dirty way to fake depth of field using the blur tool. Now the blur tool, if we zoom in very closely, you can see how it blends the pixels. It actually smooths them out using what is called anti-aliasing, and it increases the gradients. So I'm going to zoom back out, and you can see again kind of the before and after of using the blur. It's much different from the smudge tool. So now I'm going to move towards the smudge tool, and the smudge tool actually takes pixels and mushes them into and interrupts the area of other nearby pixels. Now sometimes I might use the smudge tool if I wanted to kind of make motion lines. And we've already got some pretty good motion in this image that we're looking at. But it might be fun to just play with the concept of adding motion lines behind the figure to kind of give it a sense of speed. And so I'm going to duplicate the layer so you can see how this effect will work. Again, I'm going to select a different size brush. I think a little larger in this case. I think I'm going to set it to about 42 pixels. And again, I do not want this to be too soft nor too hard. If I had a very hard brush, it would make very hard lines that didn't blend well into the background coming off the figure. But it's going to be a little bit of a harder brush than we've used with the blur. So we'll set it to about 75%. And then the strength of the brush I can set to, let's start with about 80% strength, and we can make it more if we need to. So what I'm going to do is just click and drag. Oh, see, now that is way too much. So we're going to back off on the strength of the effect. And then maybe use a little bit smaller size brush and a little less hard. And again, through experimentation, we can see that we can add a little bit of motion coming off the figure. And it's as if we're kind of, that's a little bit too much. It's as if we're faking the sense of this figure going by very quickly. So you can see that the smudge tool actually pushes the pixels into the zone of nearby pixels. So it kind of warps, it sort of warps this a little bit, and maybe I'm overdoing it a bit just for demonstration. Probably wouldn't go to this level of extreme. But it is kind of fun to know that you can add these types of effects. And so you can see the before and the after. We've added a little bit of motion lines, coming off the figure to sort of enhance that idea of speed going by the viewer. So that explains the difference between the blur, sharpen, and smudge tool. And this concludes the demonstration.